party unity. I'm bringing back party unity. That lasted 10 minutes. The half of the party went that way, the other half went this way, and then it's completely chaotic. Politicians need to learn to know that words matter, and it's not the same as, again, giving out an empty random policy idea. It's worse because you're just saying words without really realizing it's a version of lying, essentially, because you didn't really have a plan. What was your plan for integrity or professionalism? That's the issue.
But Maya, you can't. Let me ask you: could you accuse the Prime Minister himself of lacking integrity, and if so, where's the evidence for that?
I mean, I have to be polite, but they're all politicians. So, I mean, what can you say? Establishment politicians, it's quite difficult to have a foolproof integrity and going about not lying. But, I mean, I think he's become too robotic. And on the one hand, he was not really from the political class himself in terms of background. He's not like David Cameron, but he was the product of the corporate world. And then as a young politician, a product of people like George Osborne. And he became a version of them in a sense that people like him, despite the fact that he was rich, he didn't have any working class friends.
That's not an impediment.
No, but he didn't have any working class friends, as he would say. Obviously, he made a joke, or said something when he was young. He should still be relatively a normal person compared to like Winston Churchill back in the day, but he's not. He's still acting like a robot with 2 batteries.
Acting like a robot. I hope that they're Duracell. Ali Milani, you know Boris Johnson because you stood against the man in Uxbridge and South Ruislip. What do you make of the question that James has asked about integrity and professionalism in this government, given where we are now?
Yeah, I do. Look, this is kind of my I told you so tour.
I'm sure it's very lucrative.
Yeah, it's the butterfly effect. If you wanted to go back in time, you could make sure I'd win and all this wouldn't have happened.
It's your fault.
It's partly my fault. Look, I agree. I think this is actually cowardice on the part of the Prime Minister. He's nowhere to be seen today. I think he's up north somewhere. Someone's got to check all the fridges to make sure he's not hiding them on. The reality is you can't fix a problem until you acknowledge it. And I think if Rishi Sunak wanted to acknowledge the problem of trust, integrity in our politics, he would be leading today. That's what a leader does. He stands up in the House of Commons and says, everything that's come before me, we are going to change now. The reality is, you're right, I do know Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson is who he has always been. He's left office as he came in. He has always lied. He's always had impropriety and allegations of impropriety following him everywhere he's went. And he has lowered the standard of public office in this country. It's a shame, really. And we heard earlier, all these politicians and the sort of skepticism around politics. That doesn't need to be the case. Boris Johnson has injected this in our politics by normalising the standard of behaviour, normalising lies. And the real shame is Rishi Sunak had a unique opportunity today as a Prime Minister to show some leadership, to stand in the House of Commons and say, we're done with this kind of politics, we're going to move on. But he's being held hostage by the right of his party. He hasn't got a backbone. It's complete cowardice, and now he's hiding somewhere up north. He had a real opportunity, and he's let the country down.
You think it's the right that he's basically cowering to?
Yes, of course it is. Yeah, he's terrified. He knows, first of all, it's what he's given everyone a free vote. And he said today, I saw an interview today, everyone can sort of vote their conscience. He's terrified because he knows that this Conservative Party, it's what Joe Biden has said about the Republican Party in America. This isn't your grandparents' Republican Party. Well, this isn't your grandparents' Conservative Party anymore. Boris Johnson has changed the Conservative Party. The likes of Nadine Dorris, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and all these lot have changed the Conservative Party, and they're holding Rishi Sunak hostage. He knows he needs to keep him happy. That's why he jumped on a bus or a train as far as he could to make sure that he wasn't in the House of Commons today, because that way he'd have to make a decision.
Jonathan List, pretty damning from Ali there. Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything Ali's just said. The only impressive thing about Rishi Sunak is the man with such little backbones even able to stand up properly. He has no political judgment, no integrity, no competence, no judgment whatsoever, and that has always been the case. The most extraordinary thing about Rishi Sunak is he was ever able to persuade anyone that he wasn't simply on the level of a junior minister who was in the right place at the right time whenever it came up for promotion. This man should be nowhere near high office. And when he came into Downing Street and said that he was going to be the man of integrity and trust, it was all words, all sound bites, all of it was completely fake. He came in, the first thing he did was promote Suella Braverman, a woman who'd resigned from the cabinet a few days earlier for breaking the ministerial code, a woman who herself is on the far right, and we should be honest in saying that should be nowhere near high office either. And not only that, he promoted people like Gavin Williamson, Nadeem Zahawi, Dominic Raab, who all had allegations trailing them and all led to their resignations from the government. Rishi Sunak, absolutely in lockstep, has to take responsibility for all those decisions, in addition, obviously, to the Rwanda policy, which absolutely has his name all over it. But as it, just in terms of tonight, if he wanted to take a stand, he had so many opportunities, as Ali was saying, to do so, but instead he allowed Johnson every single one of his completely shameful honours to go through, and now he's not even showing up.
Not everyone. Nadine didn't get one.
Well, that was he argues that he wasn't responsible for taking anything off the list, and it was Holak that took off 8 names. But the point is that if Rishi Sunak wants to establish integrity, well, he's a bit late in doing it because he's never been able to.
But Jonathan, you're a political commentator. You know that politics is the art of the possible. And Rishi Sunak came in. He didn't win the vote of the members. He's got a pretty delicate political tightrope to tread ahead of a general election. He's trying to keep his party together as best it can. Ali's talked about the fact that the far right's nipping at his heels. What else is he supposed to do?
He's supposed to actually show some backbone and strength and political judgment and lead, rather than be following a sort of a ragtag bunch of basically hard right people in his own party who have no business dictating the party or dictating the government of this country.
James, very quick comment from you. James, are you still there? Maybe James. Maybe James is listening. That's fine. Let's go to our next question from Hassan in Cambridge. Hassan, good evening.
I actually campaigned for Ali Milani in 2019.
What a wonderful man you are.
Would have been a much nicer place if he had won. My question was about whether the Bank of England is fit for purpose, considering they completely missed the rising inflation and then had to scramble and do 13 rate rises in 2 years. Do we need a new governor or a new mandate for the Bank of England?
I think it's a very interesting question that you raise, Hassan. A lot of commentators have asked the same question. Maya, what do you make of this?
I mean, I think it's time to have serious conversations and thoughts about the institutions like Bank of England. And we don't have to go extreme. We don't have to say, well, everything's perfect, don't touch it, or bring it down and bring back the gold standard. It doesn't have to be things like that. But it's still relatively a new model in terms of the regime of monetarism under the new Bank of England. And I think it's time to actually have this conversation about the relationship between the elected government and these institutions, because, for example, when we had the situation with Liz Truss and that budget, so there will be some people on the left who would say, well, it was her responsibility to pick up the phone, sure. And there were some people on the right saying, well, Bank of England should have been prepared randomly. And I get that point as well. But I think if they have mechanisms where you actually know exactly every kind of option or possibility of what could happen in the country, sort of like, I know it's a terrible example, but when they are now having these conversations and inquiry about COVID and saying being more prepared for pandemics in the future, when it comes to monetary policies and economic policies, especially when it comes to interest rates, there has to be a more open and transparent kind of route and different options so that we could actually have. So they don't get shocked if Kwasi introduces a new budget.
Well, it was a bit extreme, that budget, wasn't it?
Well, I think that, but
the gilt market completely spiked, mortgage market was completely dislocated, and people's mortgage rates went up.
The reaction was absolutely, it was a shock. But at the same time, and you might say that it was the rhetoric of the budget created that rather than the actual, for example, tax rates. I know for some, especially on the more centre-left, that was still tax cuts and all this. But it was only going back to Gordon Brown days. It wasn't like eliminating taxation.
Jonathan?
I don't think the Bank of England is fit for purpose, actually. And I wonder if it's actually time for ministers to take ultimate responsibility for economic policy by maybe reversing the independence of the Bank of England. Well, in some way,
you heard it here first. This is pretty big.
It's worth considering, because the Bank of England right now, it's not necessarily all the Bank of England's fault, but they have one lever, or if you like, one nail and one hammer, and so they are just hammering it. That's all they can do. So right now, obviously, you have inflation, and the old rule book for inflation is when you have inflation, you raise interest rates, because inflation, which is traditionally caused by a surplus of demand in the economy, so you reduce demand. Right now, inflation is not being driven by demand in the economy. We are not living in boom times. People are not going out spending more than they can afford. Inflation is being caused by other things, but people are struggling to live. So if you keep on raising interest rates, you're not going to sort of encourage people to spend less. You're going to encourage people to live in greater hardship, in more penury. That is a completely ludicrous economic policy, a completely ludicrous lever to be pulling when people are not sort of over, demanding in the economy. So why are we still raising interest rates when people can't afford that?
Well, Emma, Jonathan raises this point about taking independence back from the Bank of England because policymakers have more levers who are politicians. But the whole entire purpose of giving independence was that you don't have the electoral cycle dictating what your interest rate is.
Yeah, and I think that when it comes to continuity, I think there's something in that argument that I don't think taking back independence would entirely work. But there is also this disconnect where you see, and the mini budget is an exact example of that, where there is a disconnect between who is ultimately responsible, because the actions that the Bank of England took after Liz Truss's mini budget did harden down on some of those policies and did ultimately make things worse. But where's the political responsibility lie in that now? I know obviously everyone's going to say it is Liz, and I'm not here trying to defend her, but the fact that the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing ultimately led to that situation completely being exasperated. And so at the time, that I think we didn't really talk about this enough. This is an interesting question actually for back then, and it kind of got skipped over. I mean, and I know many were, both in the Conservative Party and Labour, very keen to compare Liz to a lettuce and put the blame on her, but there was more to that.
Well,
That conversation is still open.
Truss putting an accelerator on the economy, the Bank of England putting a brake on it.
Yeah.
And anyone who's ever driven a car knows that is not that's not going to help your engine.
That's a very
I failed my test 7 times, but even I know that.
That's a very fair point. Ali?
Yeah, I think the bit that I'm most interested in is this abdication of responsibility that's often done by the government that hides behind independence. That's one of my biggest problems with it, because you can't look at the current problems with interest rates. If you look at it as moment zero, then sure, you can hide behind the independence. But it comes in the context of inflation. It comes into the context of the last 13 years of Conservative government, and more specifically the Liz Truss budget, which is probably the single most damaging budget in my lifetime, at least in terms of the reaction that you saw from.
But that was the market reaction, wasn't it? I mean, the Bank of England on that particular case had to intervene to stabilise a market dislocation that had occurred on the back of the decision that was made by the markets of what Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng put forward, which they had no faith in.
Yeah, but they had no faith in it. Well, the government hadn't done the work. You could clearly see that the government hadn't done the work to win any sort of trust or to even communicate its policy effectively to the country. It was a knee-jerk reaction, having just won the premiership and wanting to maybe distance themselves from Boris Johnson. And you saw the reaction of that. But to see it as moment zero and to hide behind independence is a real problem, because you want the government to take responsibility, not abdicate it.
Indeed. Right, great. So we've had, you can see that this is an interesting panel. They're not holding back. We've already had independence being revoked from the Bank of England. I don't think we'd be hearing that on Cross Question, but you heard it here first. If you want to get your question into the panel, you know what to do. It's 0345 6060 973. You can also text on 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're watching Cross Question or listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:20.
LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
This is Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:22. I'm joined by Mahyar Tousi, the YouTuber, Emma Best from the London Assembly, the Conservative member there, Jonathan Liss, the political commentator, and Ali Milani, who's a Labour activist and also stood against Boris Johnson in the last election. You know what to do. Get your calls and your questions in on 03456060973. You can text 84850. Our next question is a text question from Beth on the Wirral. David Cameron says austerity made us better prepared for the COVID pandemic. Is he right or living in denial about the effects of his decisions? Ali Milani.
I want to live on what planet David Cameron is living on. This is a ludicrous statement. Look, the reality is we walked into the pandemic with millions of people on the waiting list. We walked into the pandemic with the NHS severely underfunded. We walked into the pandemic with people in the healthcare sector saying we were absolutely not prepared for the existing flu pandemics that were going to come, or the flu winter crises that usually come. And then we got hit with a global pandemic that saw one of the worst health crises in a generation. And so the years of austerity that drove our NHS into the ground are absolutely part of the reason why the response to the pandemic was so difficult, as well as just utter incompetence and corruption in government. But to state that we were well prepared going into a pandemic because of austerity is really dreamland. And I think he needs a welfare check.
But what he was saying was that if they hadn't actually taken the measures they would have had, we would have gone into the pandemic not only with a COVID crisis, but also with a fiscal crisis as well. Because it was all about trying to get borrowing under control on the back of the financial crisis, wasn't it? You don't have any sympathy with that?
No, I just don't understand the logic there, because look, I think we had around 4 million people on waiting lists when it goes to the pandemic. Today, it's 7 million, right? So people look at the crisis in the NHS right now and they say, well, we've got 7 million people on the waiting lists, and that's the result of the pandemic. And that's because we're catching up to what happened in the pandemic. Well, we had 4 million on beforehand, and that's because of the underinvestment consistently in the NHS by the Conservative Party and David Cameron's government. And I think he's just trying to rewrite history.
Emma, Ali's not buying David Cameron's arguments, are you?
I am a lot more than Ali, it sounds. But no, there's look, and this is perhaps this isn't a popular statement, but we never had true austerity in this country. We did try and bring the fiscal control, get onto better fiscal standing, and actually we didn't, because you see the NHS, the spending grew every single year. That's why that we did have a good place to go into the COVID pandemic. And if we hadn't had some fiscal control, we would have been in a worse place. But I don't know how you can look at the fact that we've had an NHS budget. It's now almost 200 billion, I think. It's the investment into the NHS has been consistent. There's now more doctors and nurses than there ever were under a Labour government. So it is true that we have been investing in the NHS. And I'm not saying that there's not issues. Of course I'm not. I mean, we all live in this society. We all experience the issues with the NHS. But to argue that we had completely underfunded the NHS is just not true.
But Emma, look, the junior doctors who are asking for 35% pay rise would disagree with you. So would the nurses who were asking for a 19% pay rise. The Royal College of Nursing still has not accepted the 5% plus pay offer plus the bonus. So the feeling is that for years they were underpaid.
And when people ask this question, look, I'd love to pay nurses, a £100,000 salary because they are deserving it and they are working every single day. There is not an amount of money that they aren't worth, but we have to look logically at our country and what we can afford. And so if you ask any serious Labour politician, and they will tell you they would not be able to afford those rises. They would not be able to afford those wages.
I'm sorry, I really have a problem with this affordability stuff. It really bugs me. It's only an affordability question when it's nurses. It's only an affordability question when it's teachers. It's only affordability question when it's train drivers. It's only an affordability question when it's working class
because of numbers, to be fair. And
it's not because of numbers, because when we spend ridiculous amounts of money on ludicrous policy like the Rwanda policy, no one bats an eyelid from the right. No one says that there's an affordability crisis.
Actually, I do. I said that it wasn't a good policy because I said it was spending too much
money.
The
Conservative Party
you'll find that a lot of people did. You'll find a lot of people did, and people do want to fight for
when it's nurses and doctors. We never look at it when
it's the scale. And if you want to look at a difference between capital and revenue projects, there's a massive difference. And it's just not affordable. And to compare the two is just ridiculous.
Thank you, Emma. Jonathan.
Well, look, I mean, the only word I ever really want to hear from David Cameron is sorry. And so far, he hasn't said it in all the years since he left office. And until he does, I'm really not interested in hearing a word that man has to say. He's been on a self-exculpation tour for the last 7 years, trying to gloss over his dismal record as Prime Minister, to no avail. People like me aren't buying it, certainly. And I think the majority of the people in the country aren't buying it either.
He was also sending text messages over Greensill, to be fair.
Absolutely. Look, this man is in a way worse than his successors, because at least everyone knew they were really bad, and they themselves knew they were really bad. But David Cameron still has this idea that he was actually quite good, that he was somehow, sort of unjustly, pushed from office by sort of external factors. Where really
he lost the referendum, didn't he?
He was the author of his own misfortune, and it wasn't just the referendum for which he should be held accountable. It's also the cruel and completely needless policy of austerity, which cut public services to the bone and sort of blighted the lives of millions of people in this country.
Jonathan, we
now just sort of accept as some kind of necessary. We even talk about it at all.
But Jonathan, we did have a financial crisis at the time, right? And I understand that there was, understandably, a lot of feeling amongst members of the public. They had bailed out the financial sector and all the irregularities that went on there, and there was a real feeling of angst about it, understandably. But we did need to bail out the banking sector to get the country on a firm footing, and that did involve making some cuts, didn't it?
Cuts are never necessary. Cuts are always a political choice. Now, that's a political choice the government decided to make, but it wasn't a necessary political choice. And there are plenty of economic arguments that say you can actually spend money. You can, you have the advantage of a central bank, provided you're not sort of spending money in the way that Liz Truss is planning to spend it. If you're planning on things that actually need to be spent. If you notice about the Liz Truss budget, that actually the biggest part of that budget was in fact the energy price cap guarantee.
Yes.
And the markets didn't budge after that. It was only when she was proposing ludicrous tax cuts
on the
richest, for example, that's what sent the markets over. That's what it wasn't. That's what sent the markets over the edge. It wasn't the energy. Everyone agreed that we needed to have a bit of action on energy. And the government can always spend money when it wants to, on Brexit, on COVID. The magic money tree was always a complete fantasy.
Understood. Mahyar, you're not buying it?
No, well, firstly, I feel sorry for Emma being the only Tory on the panel, simply targeted from all sides. But I think we got sidetracked because the main question obviously was about what David Cameron said. And you said perfectly, because obviously if it was in that context, it sounds much worse, but not to defend him or even that government. But the argument was that, as you said, he would believe that if we hadn't done any version of housekeeping, as Margaret Thatcher would have said, then we would have been completely unprepared. Some people would agree, some people would disagree, saying, austerity would just go completely bad. I get it. The main issue is, when it came to the pandemic and future pandemics or anything else that will happen, it's not just black and white in terms of just spending or not spending. Obviously, spending usually helps. Anything public resources or infrastructure. But the whole point of the inquiry, most of the inquiry was actually been asking the right questions about also methods and, learning the lessons. And it's not just about, okay, it should have been 10 rather than 8. That part of the inquiry was essentially more sexy, and that's why the media attention is on it. But I don't think that's the main point. Obviously, I'll also focus on the budget and spending and everything else, or cutting. But the most of the conversation has been actually about, okay, did the conversation happen between this division or that division, at that department or the Treasury? These are the things we should get right first. And that applies to, obviously, the pandemics, as the NHS, to even the Bank of England relationship that we're going to be talking about in the future. So the Tories can't really just completely defend that, obviously, austerity or semi-austerity helped not be completely unprepared. But the other side can't also just throw money at it. It sounds like that's what they say.
Well, I mean, the point we made, Ali made, is there's always money to be found when, you want to do things like the Rwanda scheme. That's the argument that's been made.
I get that. And Jonathan also said cuts are always a political choice. But everything is a political choice, and that's the whole point of government and politicians. The issue is, and Emma said, I would love to pay nurses £100,000. And obviously, I would argue, for example, the Rwanda policy or even the COVID spending, which was billions, they are chunks or one-offs. You could disagree with the policy, and that's a different argument. Whereas with the nurses and teachers and all these workers, when I say it was the numbers, it was the quantity of the workers, and it's every year. And no government, no political party would consciously choose to completely and proactively betray a massive chunk of voters. These people vote, and that's the whole problem. And they might make a wrong choice, but it's not really malicious in that sense.
Well, thank you very much. Well, cross questions already got sparky. I think it was 8:27 when it was really kicking off. It's getting very lively indeed in the cross question studio tonight. You know what to do if you want to get a question into our panel. You can call 0345 6060 973. You can also text in on 8485. You can ask the ever-present and extremely helpful Alexa to send a comment to LBC, followed by your question if you so wish. You're watching or listening to Cross Question on LBC at 8:32, the news headlines with Tim Daly.
It looks like Rishi Sunak will not be taking part in a potential vote on a report which found his predecessor Boris Johnson lied to MPs. They're currently debating the findings of the Privileges Committee, which looked into his knowledge of lockdown parties. It's emerged the British billionaire Hamish Harding is one of those on board a missing submersible which takes people to see the wreck of the Titanic. It lies in 12,500 feet of water. It's thought the submersible can carry up to 5 people. And a teenage boy has been stabbed to death in the Paddington area of London. A murder investigation is underway after the 17-year-old was found at lunchtime and pronounced dead at the scene. LBC weather, some showers in the far northwest tonight, while heavy rain will move into the southwest during the early hours, a low of 12 degrees.
LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. I'm joined by my very interesting panel. And we've got quite a lot of interesting, originally Iranian representation on the panel this evening, which I actually am delighted about because Iran is one of my favourite countries in the world. If you haven't been, you should go. It's a wonderful place. I speak, of course, of Mahyar Tousi on my left here, who's a YouTuber. And Mahyar, you do a lot of stuff, you do a lot of YouTube, but you're also very interested in the preservation of British culture.
Yes, I guess it might sound a cliche, but apparently not these days. My mother was a political refugee from Iran, and I was a kid, and when I came here, obviously for me and my family, this was a fresh start, and we appreciated everything about the culture and the system, despite all the problems, obviously. But no country is perfect, and I think that's why I got interested also in current affairs and everything else, because or promoting the British values or just basic Western values, because I think it's quite difficult for people to actually see what we have compared to the rest of the continent and countries.
Indeed. And Emma, you're at the London Assembly Deputy Leader of the Conservatives. You didn't fancy a crack at the mayoralty?
No, I didn't, because we have a really fantastic candidate in Susan Hall, and I think she's going to win it. So
you're backing Susan?
Yes,
she was
I am.
She was in here the other evening?
Yes.
Very good. And Jonathan Liss, a political commentator. We've shared panels many times, Jonathan. How did you end up from training to be an actor to working in the European Union?
Actors can work in lots of different fields. I think all of us are performing to some extent, but we can. I think actually, on a serious point, we're all performing. We're all taking on roles all the time.
Yeah.
Right now, we're taking on the roles of people on a panel. When we go into the shop,
That's a very good point.
When we go into the shop, we're taking on the role of customer. When we go and talk to our parents, we're taking on the role of children.
I never thought of myself as an actor.
So we're all sort of showing different aspects of our personas. But the truth is that I never intended to go and work in the European Parliament, but a job came up and I quite wanted one. So that's how.
Excellent. Good. And Ali, you actively involved in politics and also read international relations at university, which I was delighted to, because I did too.
Yes, yeah.
Has that served you well?
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, on the issue of acting, no one is a bigger actor in British politics than Boris Johnson. So I think
it's the one thing he's actually good at.
Yeah,
it's like drinking. Everything he mentions.
I mentioned I once did an interview with him where he walked directly out of camera shot, ruffled his hair, and then went straight into character and came back into the acting. I think all of us politicians could take a few lessons on. But yes, I studied international politics at Brunel, which is where I stood against Boris Johnson. And my sort of journey through student politics, I know student politics is often ridiculed in mainstream.
You were deputy head of the NUS.
Yes, I was. I was first vice president, Muslim vice president of the NUS Union Development as well. So it was a huge advantage.
Okay, excellent, super. Okay, let's go to our next question. A text question from Trevor in Leeds. Suella Braverman wants police to use stop and search a lot more to help get weapons, particularly knives, off the streets. If it saves lives, what's the problem? Well, we were discussing that in the last hour, in the first hour of the programme. Ali Milani.
Well, it doesn't. It's not effective. I was listening to your show previous, and I had quite a few callers, and you had some guests on. The reality is the data shows that it doesn't really work. You mentioned earlier on that the actual percentage of outcomes in terms of stop and searches related to the reason that you were stopped and searched was maybe 20%, maybe even lower than that. This is an issue that's incredibly close to my heart. I grew up with the issue of knife crime in my community. I lost friends to knife crime. Me and my friends were consistently stopped and searched. And the reality is that stop and search disproportionately affects minority communities. It completely obliterates relationships between communities and the police. All stop and search did when I was growing up was teach me to hate the police and fear the police. And the reality is, if we want to really tackle the issue of knife crime, and I don't mean what politicians often do, which is where they come on here and try and act tough and use every measure available to them so that the public think they're getting tough on it, but it never really works. Yep. If we want to get a handle on this, there needs to be serious, good relationships between the communities and the police. And that does not happen when we obliterate it by disproportionately targeting communities, particularly minority communities. And the result is, if you look at the data, and you've seen reports from organisations like Full Fact, University of Bradford, have consistently shown that stop and search does not work. So for me, it's not just an issue of the questions around racism and impacts of minority communities. It just doesn't work.
Okay, Jonathan, you're nodding.
I agree with everything that Ali's just said. I mean, I think that ethnic minorities are 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched.
But what's wrong with that? If an ethnic to actually make you feel safe, as long as it's done with courtesy and decency.
Who does it make you feel safe? And what is the purpose of this policy? Because the effect of it is to completely alienate vast sections of society and to make people feel that the Met is for some people and against other people, and to entrench this hostility, mistrust, fear of the police, which is not conducive to any kind of public good and certainly isn't conducive to policing by consent, which is a model that we're supposed to have.
But Jonathan, if there are certain areas, and there's knife crime all over the country, and the West Midlands is the highest prevalence of it in the country, if there are certain areas of any city where there are pockets where knife crime occurs, and if there happen to be a concentration of ethnic minorities in that particular area, like I live in Tower Hamlets, for example, Why would that be a problem? Other than trying to avoid or trying to be politically correct, we're not actually helping people, are we? If we don't actually increase the stop and search in those areas.
It's not about political correctness. It's about fostering an environment where the police are actually trusted by the communities they purport to serve. And this policy has led to generations of predominantly black kids growing up thinking that the police are the biggest gang out there and that they can't be trusted. And so that's why so often when there's a crime, people stay silent because they don't trust the police. They think the police are their enemies and they're not going to help them. And that serves no one's interest in the long term.
Okay, Mahyar.
So, okay. You both obviously mentioned that there's a need to improve the trust between the community and police. Absolutely. And actually, you made a good point, Ali, about making it more community-based and in good relationships. But there's also the other side of it, so that will help the communities, to not feel the fear from the police and all that. But we also have to help the police or policing. So how do we make it more efficient, effective for them as well to ensure that we catch criminals? There's a fundamental problem that we need a long-term plan when it comes to education and prosperity and safety net and all that. Short term, the problem I have is that I don't think necessarily giving extra resources to stop and search or eliminating stop and search is just going to do anything kind of aggressive. The problem is that you need a proper long-term plan, and you say it perfectly. Until 2010s, Glasgow, most of the kids who were getting stop and search or being arrested were actually white working class kids or kind of in poverty. For various reasons, a lot of the deprived areas now is mostly ethnic minorities. So we have to look at that instead of just basically saying, okay, if you see someone who's just non-white walking around in a hoodie, just don't even approach them. I've been stop and search, and that was at the height of the Islamic kind of terrorist threats in London. To be fair, I was on a bike with a backpack and I was filming London, so the police actually stopped me. And luckily, and I know people have good experience and bad experience with the police. I was lucky that there were a couple of good police officers who actually stopped me, politely explained, okay, we've received some kind of alert about this area today.
I understand, yeah.
So just search.
I just want to. So you say you've been stopped and searched?
Yes, twice.
I've been stopped and searched about 11 times in my life.
Well,
I listened earlier. You've been pulled over.
I've been pulled over many times.
Jonathan, how many times have you been stopped and searched?
0.
Emma, how many times have you been stopped
I've
and
been
searched?
stopped and searched, and I'm really glad you can bring me in here now, because I find it really, really difficult to hear people just saying, no, we shouldn't stop and search, we should just let go of it, right? It needs to be done right, and I can completely accept that in some ways some officers have taken this in completely the wrong way and done the completely wrong thing and created tensions in the community. I've seen people stabbed in front of me. I've had a knife held to me twice. This is real for me. It's real for you, Ali. It's real for me. And I've spoken to families, and so many mothers have said to me, if only they'd stopped and searched my son to stop this. The mothers of sons that have died have said that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a problem with trust and confidence, right? And we need to address that. And things like knife wands, searching for knives, not drugs, that is absolutely one of the ways in which we need to improve this process. But too many people sit here and say, no, stop and search is completely the wrong way, it's too invasive, get rid of it, and they haven't gone through that trauma. And I recognise, Ali, that you said you have, and I do, and I understand that. But this is a really important tool, and we need to use it in the right way. We need to look at technologies such as knife wands, and every single officer needs to do this.
What's a knife wand? Sorry,
a knife wand is an instrument. It's it's an instrument that you can use to detect the metal.
I see, okay.
Instead of, because actually, and this is what I accept does cause an issue, is a lot of times younger men, especially within the black community in London, they'll be stopped and they'll search and they'll find drugs. That's not really what the police were looking for, but then they get registered for the drugs. And actually what stop and search should really be all about is taking knives and guns off our street. And so actually knife wands, I think, and looking into those new technologies and AI technology within our train stations, which the Home Office has trials, we should look more at that. But I hate it when people just dismiss it and just say, no more stop and search. It's a very useful tool.
I think the point has been very well made, Emma, on the prevalence for you as well, the importance of the issue and how you deal with it. So, still about 15 minutes to go, actually 14. So if you haven't got your question in yet, where have you been? You know what to do if you want to get a question into our panel. 0345 6060 973. You can also send a text, 84850. You're watching and listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:46.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Suella Braverman calling on police to ramp up the use of stop and search powers to prevent violence and save more lives. Joe's in Woking.
Our son was 14 and the other young lad was 16, and they were stabbed by a friend of theirs, a cannabis addict. Now this chap, it turned out, had been carrying a hunting knife strapped to his leg for some considerable time. Whilst this stop and search can, fill so many social media stories of people arguing and using it as a great excuse to get some like clicks, it's necessary.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question on LBC.
Welcome back to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:50, and our next question comes from Philip in Archway. Good evening, Philip. What would you like to ask?
Good evening, everybody. The mayor of Keighley in Yorkshire has resigned, having apologised for attending a gay pride event. Should any...
I think we've lost you, Philip. That's fine. Let me just read your question out. The mayor of Keighley in West Yorkshire has resigned after apologising for attending a pride event because it doesn't tally with his religious views. Should any mayor really allow a personal view to affect how they serve as a figurehead like this? Let me give you a bit of background. So Mohammed Nazim described attending a pride event as a lapse in judgment, saying it contradicted his beliefs. He's resigned as mayor of Keighley and has been suspended from the Conservative group on Bradford Council. He says he intends to carry on serving the community as an independent. Jonathan Liss.
Finally, you come to me for this one. So I'm a bit confused by this. Why would he go if it contradicted his beliefs?
That's good.
I don't understand why he'd have suddenly realised that it contradicted his beliefs after he'd been. Did he not know what pride was?
Maybe I don't know the background to it. Maybe he was put under pressure by people. I have no idea.
Look, as a proud gay person myself, I would never ask anyone to attend a pride march if they didn't want to. The whole point of being there is that you're there because you want to be there, not because someone's forced you to be there. So that's the first point. But on the other hand, there is I think should people in public life who represent the community should be encouraged to participate in these events if they want to. Now, if they don't want to, as I've just said, they should be forced to, but I think people are entitled to know that and to ask questions about it, to ask questions about why this person might not want to go to an event that is meant to be representing and including people across the community. And I think it's reasonable to ask elected officials to be held accountable for those beliefs. I don't think that your religious views should prevent you from holding public office in this country, but I do think that people should account for their views and explain them to their constituents. And it doesn't seem as though this has been satisfactorily handled in this case.
It's interesting because you mentioned that religious views shouldn't hamper people holding senior public office, but you look at what happened with Kate Forbes in the SNP election, you look at Tim Farron, the former Liberal Democrat leader, who were both vilified in parts of the commentariat for certain views that they held. They're both religious Christians. How do we deal with that particular situation?
Well, I think that people are entitled to believe whatever they want. What I'm interested in is how they vote and what their policies are and how those beliefs might impact upon their constituents. It doesn't interest me at all what Kate Forbes or anyone else believes in their heart. If, whatever they think about anyone, what does interest me is the policies they're going to put forward as elected leaders, because that does affect me and people around the country.
Emma?
Yeah, much like Jonathan, I'm still trying to get my head around what happened. I mean, he turned up at Pride and was like, this is a lot of colour, what's going on? and so, yeah, but much the same as Jonathan has just been saying, look, I think that you are entitled to hold any view that you wish. I believe very strongly in freedom of speech, and I think people should be allowed to express those views as well. But I also think that the society and the electorate should be able to judge you on those views. And so I think if he would like to stand as an independent and suggest that he does not agree with Pride or Pride events, I think he should take that to the ballot and let the people decide whether they agree with that view.
But do you think, it's interesting that you're making this point, because Philip, who asked this question, said, should any mayor really allow a personal view to affect how they serve as a figurehead? So it's like almost, should you park your personal view for the greater...
No, you absolutely shouldn't. If you want to be, the homophobe, if you want to be racist, then if you want to be transphobic, then people should absolutely know where you stand on it. Don't pretend you're not. And this is what I'd like to. And this is the thing with free speech and politicians. I hate people that that's not their view, and they're just telling you what they think you want to hear. Because if you do that, then we can't actually have an honest discussion about those issues. If you're upfront about why you feel that, I'd love to know. Because I honestly think that you can be supportive of Pride and people living their life the way they want and come from any religious background. Mm-hmm. That's my personal view. So, but if he doesn't believe that, I'd like to have that honest discussion. And so I'd really prefer people to be upfront about what they think. Okay. So I do think you have to be upfront.
Okay, Maya.
Yeah, shockingly, I agree with Jonathan. And I actually add to that. Obviously, the priority should be about judging politicians based on their actions. And then, as Emma said, obviously it's best for us to know their views. But at the same time, obviously, the politicians at the same time, as long as they're not really spreading the hate or any sort of division, for example, if they do go to Pride, if they go there and say, anybody who doesn't come here, we should attack them, or vice versa, if they don't go to Pride and say Pride is the worst thing ever. Because these are comments, they're not policies, but they are very divisive. So as long as they don't do that, mostly they should be judged based on their votes and policies. I think right now, that's why politicians are just so feeble, because they feel so much pressure. Yeah. And how do you end up there? As you said, you see colourful stuff, you're like, what do you think? It's McDonald's in 1980s?
Ali?
I think we found someone that said something more ludicrous than David Cameron this week. To be honest, I don't really want to hear my politicians talk about religion. I'm like Jonathan said,
we don't do God, as Alistair Campbell famously said.
Yeah, I want to know how you're going to vote on the everyday issues that affect our lives. If you hold discriminatory views, I definitely want to know, so I don't vote for you. My bigger problem here is he has apologised for attending a Pride event. It's not that he's not gone.
But he's saying it's a question of his belief.
He took the wrong left and ended up at a Pride event. This is ludicrous. Yeah. It's not.
The point is, he shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Well, that's my problem. He's gone and then apologised. It's not like he's not.
No, indeed.
So, indeed. I'm very strict on this, and as I'm sure everyone on the panel is, if you hold any discriminatory views to any groups in the UK, you have no space in public office.
Indeed.
And I wish we'd held that standard to Boris Johnson before.
Okay, I want to try and fit in 2 more questions. So let's be pithy on these. So there's a text question from Jennifer in Chichester. A 13-year-old has been told off by her teacher, questioning a classmate who identifies as a cat. How free should children be to question their identity like this? This is the teacher told the pupil at a Church of England school who refused to accept that her classmate identifies as a cat that she was despicable. Maya.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with this is that the whole debate is mostly now dominated the voices of the minority, angry this side and that side. So that's why that story, for example, becomes huge, because it kind of undermines, the ordinary people who, feel obviously that's not their gender, or they want to feel something else. At the same time, those who have, criticism of the gender, their trans lobby and all that, this is not really helping anybody. And the fact that people on Twitter, I remember earlier today, everybody was just attacking from both sides. Right? Okay, there's no nuance apparently anymore. That you create a situation where clearly Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, that a kid would, on one side, would say that about the cat thing, and the other kid would just sound like a transphobe to the teacher, and the teacher is just there, just causing chaos.
Emma, do we have to sort of be? What do we do with this?
I watched this clip. I don't know whether it's true or what. It was a bit odd, right? But mine's really right here. I don't want to talk about some 13-year-old and their teacher talking about whether a classmate identifies as a cat. I want to talk about improving trans healthcare. I want to talk about the fact that we never talk about trans men rights and where that falls into it. They're always so
But if
ignored.
it's happening,
and
Emma,
then hang on, and then on the other side, I want to have a serious conversation about making sports fair and how we move forward and what that looks like. But we're not talking about the serious things and the serious ways in which we have an inclusive society, but it's because we're talking about 13-year-olds taking the mick, saying they're a cat, and it's not representative of what the trans community are experiencing, so let's not bother.
Jonathan, maybe they won't take them. Maybe they genuinely thought that they were a cat. I don't know.
Well, I completely agree with what Emma just said. I mean, I think what this really does is sensationalises something and trivialises a really important discussion, and that is, and that's a real shame, because we need to be having real conversations about trans rights and trans healthcare, just as Emma was saying. And when you hear something about identifying as a cat, it just feels to me like the arguments we used to hear about gay marriage, about, well, if 2 men can marry, then why not a man and a dog, as a Tory MEP once argued with me.
The donkey, by the way.
Back in the day. And so I kind of think it's quite offensive in itself, and that we have no business talking about 2 13-year-olds on a radio programme, frankly.
Ali, do you sympathise with that, or do you think this is totally ridiculous and should be called out?
I really agree with Emma, and I want to be talking about things like healthcare and protecting people's rights. The problem is, the thing I want to talk about is that this isn't by accident. This isn't just a cultural thing that's happening. This is the standard of debate at the very elite level of politics, and it's filtered down into our schools. I think this is by design. There's a cultural war being driven, and I'm not going to accuse individual politicians or even parties, but I don't think there's any doubt across the country, and even in Westminster, the limited time I try to spend there, that there is a culture war happening, and this standard of debate is being driven for political reasons, and this is the reality. This is what happens when there's cowardice. This is what happens when politicians don't lead and lift the standard of debate up onto things like trans healthcare and protecting people. Okay. When the debate is taken into a gutter, it filters into our school.
Okay, I do feel sorry for cats, to be honest. But anyway, that's another whole question for another time. But let's end with this fun question. I'm already over time, so let's make it pithy. This is from Gareth in Swansea. A new survey about DIY has revealed just how clueless most of us actually are, with 1 in 10 copying terms heard on the TV to sound clever. What's your proudest DIY achievement and your worst disaster, Emma?
I have 0 DIY achievements. My proudest DIY achievement is marrying my wife, and when she once fixed her boiler, I told her it was the most romantic thing I've ever seen.
Outsourcing is always very good. Maya?
My only achievement is the most millennial thing ever. I tried to do smart home. So I changed all the light bulbs and everything else with like new electric, whatever they're called.
LED?
I can't remember what they're called. But the worst one, it was actually the same time, because I was trying to change the plugs in the wall, and half the building, the lights went off.
Jonathan?
I once actually managed to fix my boiler when it wasn't working through following a very, very simple YouTube video.
Oh, very good.
But just not a DIY achievement.
Oh, wow.
One of the proudest achievements of my life. But then when I tried to hammer a mirror into my wall shortly afterwards, half the wall came down.
Oh dear. Ali?
Well, I have no achievements in DIY. In fact, My partner does all the DIY in our house, and we break gender barriers and stigmas in that regard. Myself and my cat just observe and make sure everything's gone correctly. I do have disasters, though. I once got a flat in Willesden, and it took me 4.5 hours to try and fix the flat and change the tyres before I gave up. Called someone to come and help me, at which point he showed up and laughed and showed me it takes 10 minutes. It's pretty embarrassing.
Superb. Excellent stuff. I really enjoyed tonight's panel. A big thank you to Mahyar Tousi, Emma Best, Jonathan Liss and Ali Milani for joining me this evening. Now, coming up in the final hour, it's interesting that there's a report out in the Times today. There's a story out saying that 2 million people in England have been on antidepressants for 5 years, despite limited evidence of the benefits of taking the drugs in the long term. This is on top of the fact that there are 8 million people in this country that are taking antidepressants regularly. Prescriptions have risen steeply in recent years, a thought to reflect the pandemic pressures and the long waits for access to talking therapies. And you've also got a situation now where more and more of these drugs are being prescribed. So my question to you is this: are we over-reliant on antidepressants in this country?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation, this is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, David Cameron has conceded his government made a mistake by focusing on preparations for a potential wave of flu and not a coronavirus-style pandemic. Speaking at the COVID public inquiry, the former Prime Minister denied austerity affected the NHS's ability to cope, but Professor Sir Michael